The first discovery, a chilling bag. It was a quiet, overcast morning on June 12, 1998, in the industrial outskirts of Chicago. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, and the streets were mostly deserted except for the occasional truck rumbling by. At around 6:45 a.m., a sanitation worker named Mike Reynolds was making his usual rounds near an abandoned lot on the edge of the city. The area was known for its dilapidated warehouses and overgrown weeds, a place where people rarely lingered unless they had to. Mike had worked this route for years, and nothing much ever surprised him, until that morning. As he approached a pile of trash near the corner of West 47th Street and South Ashland Avenue, something caught his attention. Amid the usual debris of old tires, broken furniture, and discarded fast food wrappers, there was a large, tightly tied black garbage bag. It wasn't unusual to find oversized trash bags dumped illegally in the area, but this one was different. It was oddly shaped, bulging in unnatural ways, and there was a faint, sickly sweet odor emanating from it. Mike wrinkled his nose and muttered to himself, "What the hell is that?" Curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed the bag by one of its corners, intending to toss it into the back of his truck, but as he lifted it, the weight and texture felt wrong, too heavy, too dense, and disturbingly soft in some places. A chill ran down his spine. He dropped the bag immediately and stepped back, his heart pounding. Something about it felt off. Mike hesitated for a moment, debating whether to open it or call someone. He glanced around the empty lot, the silence pressing in on him. Finally, he decided to investigate. Using a stick he found nearby, he carefully poked at the bag, loosening the knot at the top. As the bag opened slightly, the smell hit him like a punch to the gut, an overwhelming stench of decay that made his stomach churn. He gagged and stumbled back, but not before catching a glimpse of what was inside. A pale, discolored human arm, bent at an unnatural angle. "Oh my God," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. He staggered away from the bag, fumbling for the radio on his truck. "Dispatch, this is Reynolds. I think I found a body. You need to send someone out here. Now!" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, calm but concerned. "Mike, can you confirm what you're seeing? Are you sure it's a body?" "I'm not sticking around to check," Mike snapped, his voice rising. "Just get the cops out here. It's bad. Real bad." Within minutes the area was swarming with police cars, their flashing lights cutting through the gray morning. Detective Sarah Whitman, a seasoned investigator with the Chicago Police Department, arrived on the scene. She was known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense demeanor, and as soon as she stepped out of her car, she could tell this wasn't going to be a routine case. "What do we have?" she asked one of the officers, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "Sanitation worker found a bag," the officer replied, his face pale. It's bad, detective. You'll want to see for yourself." Sarah approached the bag cautiously, the smell growing stronger with each step. She crouched down and used a pair of scissors to cut the bag open further. What she saw made her stomach turn, though she kept her composure. Inside was the dismembered body of a young woman, her limbs neatly severed at the joints. The skin was pale and mottled, with signs of decomposition setting in, but what stood out most was the strange texture of some of the flesh. It looked as though parts of it had been boiled or treated with some kind of chemical. "Jesus Christ," Sarah muttered under her breath. She stood up and turned to the officers nearby. "Secure the area. I want this entire lot cordoned off. No one gets in or out without my say-so. And get forensics down here ASAP." As the crime scene tape went up and the forensic team began their work, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The precision of the dismemberment, the methodical way the body had been disposed of, it all pointed to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a random act of violence, this was calculated, deliberate. By noon, the news had already started to spread. Reporters gathered at the edge of the crime scene, their cameras trained on the activity inside. Headlines like "Grisly Discovery in Chicago's South Side" and "Dismembered Body Found in Trash Bag" began circulating on local news channels. The public was horrified, but for Sarah and her team, the horror was just beginning. As the forensic team carefully removed the remains from the bag, they made another chilling discovery. Some of the body parts showed signs of being cooked. The flesh on the arms and legs had a strange rubbery texture, as if it had been boiled or exposed to extreme heat. It was a detail that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to dispose of a body, they were sending a message. "This isn't just a murder," Sarah said quietly to her partner, Detective Mark Harris, as they stood by the edge of the lot. "This is something else, something darker." Mark nodded grimly. "You think we're dealing with a serial killer?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She stared at the bag, now empty but still reeking of death, and felt a deep, gnawing sense of dread. "I don't know," she said finally. "But whoever did this, they're not done, not by a long shot." And she was right. Over the next few months, the city of Chicago would be gripped by fear as more bodies were discovered, each one more gruesome than the last. The hunt for the killer would become one of the most intense and harrowing investigations in the city's history, pushing Sarah and her team to their limits as they raced against time to stop a monster hiding in plain sight. 2. A string of murders. The nightmare unfolds. The discovery of the first dismembered body in the abandoned lot on Chicago's South Side sent shockwaves through the city. But no one, not the police, not the public, was prepared for what would come next. Over the following weeks, the nightmare began to unfold, one gruesome discovery at a time, as the killer struck again and again, leaving a trail of horror in their wake. The second body. A chilling pattern emerges. Just 2 weeks after the first body was found on a humid July morning, a jogger running along the banks of the Chicago River stumbled upon something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. At first, she thought it was a pile of trash washed up on the riverbank, a common sight in the area. But as she got closer, she noticed the unmistakable shape of a human hand protruding from a torn plastic bag. Her scream echoed across the empty park, drawing the attention of a nearby groundskeeper, who immediately called 911. When Detective Sarah Whitman arrived at the scene, she was struck by the eerie similarities to the first case. The body, like the one found in the abandoned lot, had been dismembered with surgical precision. Some parts of the flesh showed signs of being boiled or chemically treated, and the remains were stuffed into a black garbage bag, tied tightly at the top. The victim was another young woman, likely in her mid-20s, with no identification or personal belongings to help determine who she was. "This isn't random," Sarah said to her partner, Detective Mark Harris, as they watched the forensic team work. "This is the same guy, he's sending us a message." Mark nodded grimly. "And he's getting bolder. The first body was dumped in an abandoned lot. This one's out in the open where anyone could find it." The media quickly picked up on the connection between the two cases, dubbing the unknown perpetrator the Chicago Butcher. Headlines like "Second Dismembered Body Found in Chicago" and "Is a Serial Killer on the Loose" dominated the news cycle, fueling public fear and speculation. The city was on edge, and the pressure on the police to catch the killer was mounting. The third victim. A message in the darkness. Barely a week after the second body was discovered, the killer struck again. This time the remains were found in an alley behind a rundown apartment building in the West Side neighborhood of Garfield Park. A resident taking out the trash noticed a foul smell coming from a large duffel bag left near the dumpsters. When he unzipped the bag, he was met with a sight so horrifying that he fainted on the spot. Inside the bag was the torso of a young woman, her arms and legs severed and missing. The forensic team later found traces of what appeared to be cooking oil on the body, suggesting that the killer had attempted to fry or sear parts of the flesh. It was a grotesque escalation, one that left even the most seasoned investigators shaken. "This guy isn't just killing," Sarah said during a late-night strategy meeting with her team. "He's experimenting, he's trying different methods, pushing boundaries, and he's enjoying it." The discovery of the third victim confirmed what the police had feared. They were dealing with a serial killer who was not only methodical but also sadistic. The killer seemed to thrive on the attention, leaving the bodies in places where they were sure to be found. It was as if he was taunting the police, daring them to catch him. The fourth body, a grim discovery in the suburbs. By late July, the killer's reach extended beyond the city limits. In a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Chicago, a group of teenagers exploring an abandoned house stumbled upon a horrifying scene. In the basement, they found a large metal drum, sealed with duct tape. When the police arrived and pried it open, they were met with the unmistakable stench of decomposition. Inside were the remains of another young woman, her body dismembered and partially submerged in a foul-smelling liquid. The forensic team determined that the liquid was a mixture of water and industrial cleaning chemicals, likely used in an attempt to dissolve the body. The victim's face had been mutilated beyond recognition, making identification nearly impossible. It was clear that the killer was becoming more sophisticated, using chemicals to destroy evidence and delay identification. "This guy's evolving," Mark said as he and Sarah reviewed the case files. "He's learning from his mistakes, covering his tracks better each time. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. But he's also getting more confident. He's not just dumping bodies anymore. He's experimenting with how to dispose of them. He's testing us. The fifth and sixth victims, a double horror. In early August, the killer escalated his spree in a way that shocked even the most hardened investigators. 2 bodies were discovered within days of each other, both in different parts of the city. The first was found in a dumpster behind a fast food restaurant in the South Loop. The second was discovered floating in the Chicago River, wrapped in a tarp weighted down with cinder blocks. Both victims were young women, and both had been dismembered and partially cooked. The forensic team found evidence that the killer had used a blowtorch on one of the bodies, leaving charred marks on the flesh. It was a level of brutality that left even the most experienced detectives struggling to comprehend. "This isn't just about killing anymore," Sarah said during a press briefing. "This is about control, this is about power, and this is about sending a message." The public was in a state of panic. Women were afraid to walk alone at night, and parents kept their children close. The media coverage reached a fever pitch, with news outlets speculating about the killer's identity and motives. The Chicago Butcher had become a household name, a symbol of fear and horror that loomed over the city. The killer's signature, a calculated game. As the body count rose, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The killer seemed to target women who were vulnerable, those who lived alone, worked late hours, or frequented areas with little foot traffic. He was meticulous in his methods, leaving little evidence behind and choosing locations that made it difficult for the police to track him. But there was one thing that stood out: the killer's use of cooking or chemical treatment on the bodies. It was a grotesque signature, one that set him apart from other killers. It wasn't just about hiding evidence, it was about exerting control, about turning his victims into objects to be manipulated and destroyed. "He's playing a game," Sarah said during a late-night meeting with her team. "He's testing us, seeing how far he can go before we catch him, and he's enjoying every second of it." The city on edge. By the end of August, the Chicago Butcher had claimed at least 6 known victims, and the city was gripped by fear. The police were working around the clock, but the killer always seemed to be one step ahead. Each new discovery brought fresh horror, and each day without an arrest deepened the public's sense of helplessness. For Sarah and her team, the pressure was unbearable. They knew they were racing against time, not just to catch the killer but to prevent him from striking again. But with so few leads and a killer who seemed to thrive on evasion, the task felt almost impossible. "This isn't just a case," Sarah said one night as she stared at the evidence board in the precinct. "This is a war, and we're fighting a ghost." The string of murders would continue to haunt Chicago for months, as the killer's reign of terror pushed the city to its breaking point. But for Sarah and her team, the fight was far from over. They were determined to bring the Chicago Butcher to justice, no matter the cost. 3. Common traits of the victims. A grim profile. As the body count rose and the Chicago Butcher's reign of terror continued, Detective Sarah Whitman and her team began to piece together a chilling profile of the victims. Each discovery brought new horrors, but it also revealed a disturbing pattern. One that painted a grim picture of the killer's preferences and motives. The victims weren't chosen at random. They were carefully selected, each fitting a specific profile that seemed to fuel the killer's twisted desires. Young, vulnerable women. The first and most obvious commonality among the victims was their age. All of the women were in their early to mid-20s, with the oldest victim being 28 and the youngest just 21. They were young, vibrant, and full of potential, women who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. But their youth and vitality seemed to be exactly what drew the killer to them. "These women weren't just victims," Sarah said during a late-night meeting with her team. "They were targets. He's not just killing anyone, he's choosing women who represent something to him. Maybe innocence, maybe beauty, maybe something he feels he's lost or can never have. Whatever it is, it's personal." The victims also shared a certain vulnerability. Many of them lived alone, worked late hours, or had jobs that required them to interact with strangers. Some were waitresses, bartenders, or retail workers. Jobs that often left them walking home late at night or taking public transportation through poorly lit areas. Others were students or part-time workers, juggling multiple responsibilities and often too preoccupied to notice someone following them. "He's preying on women who are isolated," Mark Harris, Sarah's partner, pointed out. "Women who don't have anyone waiting for them at home. Women who won't be missed right away if they disappear." Economic struggles and social isolation. Another common thread among the victims was their socioeconomic status. Most of the women came from working-class backgrounds, living paycheck to paycheck in modest apartments or shared housing. They didn't have the resources to own cars, which meant they often walked or relied on public transportation, making them easy targets for someone lurking in the shadows. One victim, 24-year-old Emily Carter, worked as a waitress at a diner on the South Side. She was last seen leaving her shift late at night, walking to the bus stop a few blocks away. Her co-workers described her as quiet and hard-working, someone who kept to herself and didn't have many close friends. When her dismembered body was found in a dumpster 2 weeks later, her co-workers were devastated, but not entirely surprised. "She was always so careful," one of them told the police. But I guess it wasn't enough. Another victim, 22-year-old Maria Lopez, was a part-time college student who worked evenings at a convenience store. She had recently moved to Chicago from a small town in Indiana, hoping to build a better life for herself. Her family described her as ambitious but shy, someone who struggled to make friends in the big city. When her remains were found in a black garbage bag near the Chicago River, her family was heartbroken. "She didn't deserve this," her mother said through tears. "She was just trying to make something of herself." The killer seemed to have a knack for identifying women who were socially isolated, women who didn't have strong support systems or close-knit communities to notice their absence right away. This gave him the time he needed to carry out his gruesome crimes without immediate suspicion. No signs of resistance. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the lack of evidence suggesting that the victims had fought back. There were no defensive wounds on their bodies, no signs of a struggle at the crime scenes. This led investigators to believe that the killer was either highly skilled at subduing his victims, or that he used some form of deception to lure them into a vulnerable position. "He's not snatching these women off the street," Sarah said during a briefing. "He's convincing them to go with him willingly. Maybe he's posing as someone they can trust, a cab driver, a delivery worker, or even someone offering help. Whatever it is, he's disarming them before they even realize they're in danger." This theory was supported by witness accounts. One woman, who narrowly escaped an encounter with a man she believed to be the killer, told police that he had approached her in a parking lot, offering to help carry her groceries to her car. "He seemed so normal," she said. "Polite even, but something about the way he looked at me gave me the creeps, so I said no and walked away as fast as I could." Physical appearance, a possible trigger. While the victims came from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, they all shared certain physical traits. Most were of average height and build, with long hair and youthful features. This led investigators to speculate that the killer might have been triggered by a specific type of woman, perhaps someone who reminded him of a person from his past. "Serial killers often have a type," said Dr. Alan Grayson, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case. "It's not just about physical appearance, it's about what that appearance represents to them. It could be a former lover, a family member, or even a stranger who wronged them in some way. By targeting women who fit this profile, the killer is trying to recreate or resolve whatever trauma is driving him." This theory was further supported by the killer's methodical approach. He didn't just kill his victims, he mutilated and dismembered them in ways that suggested a deep-seated rage. The fact that some of the bodies showed signs of being cooked or chemically treated added another layer of complexity, hinting at a desire to dehumanize the victims and assert control over them. A chilling pattern. As the investigation progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The killer wasn't just choosing random women, he was selecting victims who fit a specific mold, both physically and emotionally. They were young, vulnerable, and often overlooked by society. They were women who, in the killer's twisted mind, were easy to manipulate and dispose of. "This isn't just about killing," Sarah said during a press conference. "This is about power, this is about control. And this is about a deep, pathological hatred of women." The realization that the killer was targeting such specific victims only heightened the urgency of the investigation. For Sarah and her team, every new discovery was a race against time, a desperate attempt to stop the Chicago butcher before he could claim another life. But as the body count continued to rise, one question loomed over the case. What was driving this monster, and how far would he go before he was caught? 4. The killer's brutal methods, a portrait of horror. As the investigation into the Chicago butcher unfolded, one of the most horrifying aspects of the case was the sheer brutality and precision of the killer's methods. Each crime scene revealed new layers of depravity, painting a picture of a perpetrator who was not only sadistic, but also disturbingly methodical. The way the killer handled his victims, both in life and in death, left seasoned investigators shaken and forensic experts baffled. This wasn't just murder, it was a calculated ritualistic process designed to inflict maximum terror and exert complete control. Surgical precision. A killer with skills. One of the first things that stood out to investigators was the surgical precision with which the bodies were dismembered. The cuts were clean and deliberate, as if made by someone with extensive knowledge of anatomy. Limbs were severed at the joints, and there was little evidence of hesitation or struggle in the process. This level of skill suggested that the killer had some form of training, perhaps in medicine, butchery, or even mechanical work that required a steady hand and attention to detail. The way these bodies are being dismembered, it's not something just anyone could do, Detective Sarah Whitman said during a briefing with her team. This isn't sloppy or rushed, he knows exactly what he's doing, and he's taking his time to do it. Forensic pathologists confirmed that the tools used were likely sharp, high-quality instruments such as surgical scalpels, bone saws, or even specialized knives. The precision of the cuts made it clear that the killer wasn't improvising. He had planned this out meticulously, bringing the right tools for the job. This level of preparation only deepened the investigators' sense of unease. This guy isn't just killing for the sake of it, Sarah's partner, Detective Mark Harris, added. He's treating these bodies like projects, like puzzles he's taking apart piece by piece. Cooking and chemical treatment, a disturbing signature. Perhaps the most grotesque aspect of the killer's methods was his apparent fascination with altering the bodies after death. In several cases, forensic experts found evidence that parts of the victim's flesh had been cooked. Some body parts showed signs of being boiled, while others appeared to have been seared or charred, as if exposed to an open flame or a blowtorch. The forensic team even discovered traces of cooking oil on one victim, suggesting that the killer had used a frying pan or similar equipment. This isn't about hiding evidence, Dr. Alan Grayson, a criminal psychologist consulting on the case, explained. This is about control. By cooking the bodies, he's dehumanizing his victims, turning them into objects rather than people. It's a way for him to assert dominance and strip them of their identity. In other cases, the killer used industrial chemicals to treat the bodies. One victim's remains were found partially dissolved in a mixture of cleaning agents, likely an attempt to destroy evidence or delay identification. The use of chemicals added another layer of complexity to the case, as it suggested the killer had access to specialized materials and knew how to handle them safely. This isn't something you can just pick up at the local hardware store, Sarah said during a strategy meeting. He's either stealing these chemicals from a workplace or buying them under the radar. Either way, it means he's thought this through. The disposal, a calculated game. The way the killer disposed of the bodies was equally chilling. Each victim was dismembered and placed in black garbage bags, duffel bags, or other containers, which were then dumped in locations where they were likely to be found. Abandoned lots, riverbanks, dumpsters, and even suburban basements became the killer's dumping grounds. The choice of locations seemed deliberate, as if the killer wanted to ensure that his work would be discovered. He's not trying to hide these bodies, Sarah said during a press conference. He's leaving them where we can find them. This isn't about avoiding detection, it's about sending a message. The locations also varied widely, suggesting that the killer was familiar with the city and its surrounding areas. He seemed to know which places were isolated enough to allow him to work undisturbed but still accessible enough for someone to stumble upon the remains. This level of planning made it clear that the killer was highly organized and methodical. A ritualistic process. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the killer's methods weren't just about efficiency, they were part of a ritual. The dismemberment, the cooking, the chemical treatment, and the careful disposal all pointed to a deeply ingrained psychological need to control and manipulate his victims. This wasn't random violence, it was a calculated process that the killer likely found deeply satisfying. Serial killers often have rituals, Dr. Grayson explained during a team briefing. It's not just about the act of killing, it's about what comes after. The dismemberment, the cooking, the way he disposes of the bodies, these are all part of his ritual. It's how he processes what he's done and reinforces his sense of power. The ritualistic nature of the crimes also suggested that the killer was unlikely to stop on his own. Each murder seemed to escalate in brutality, as if the killer was pushing himself to go further with each victim. This escalation made it clear to investigators that they were racing against time to catch him before he struck again. Psychological implications, a killer's mindset. The brutality and precision of the killer's methods offered chilling insights into his psyche. He wasn't just killing for the sake of it. He was killing to fulfill a deep, pathological need. The way he treated the bodies suggested a profound lack of empathy and a desire to dehumanize his victims. By dismembering and altering their remains, he was stripping them of their identity and reducing them to objects he could control. "This isn't just about murder," Sarah said during a late-night meeting with her team. "This is about power, this is about control, and this is about a deep, pathological hatred of women." Dr. Grayson agreed. The cooking and chemical treatment are particularly telling. They suggest that the killer sees his victims as something to be consumed or destroyed. It's not enough for him to kill them. He has to erase them, to obliterate any trace of who they were. A killer who thrives on fear. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the killer's methods was the way he seemed to thrive on the fear and chaos he created. By leaving the bodies in places where they were sure to be found, he was ensuring that his crimes would dominate the news cycle and strike fear into the hearts of Chicago's residents. He wasn't just killing, he was creating a spectacle, a macabre performance designed to keep the city on edge. "He's playing a game with us," Mark said during a strategy meeting. "He wants us to know he's out there. He wants us to feel powerless." Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. "But he's not invincible. He's leaving clues, even if he doesn't realize it, and we're going to find him." The hunt for the butcher. As the investigation continued, the killer's methods became both a source of horror and a key to understanding his motives. Each new discovery brought fresh insights into his twisted mind, but it also raised new questions. Who was this man who could commit such atrocities? What had driven him to such depths of depravity? And most importantly, how could he be stopped? For Sarah and her team, the answers couldn't come soon enough. The Chicago butcher was still out there, and as long as he remained free, no one in the city was safe. 5. The police step in. A stalled investigation. From the moment the first body was discovered, the Chicago Police Department knew they were dealing with something far beyond the scope of an ordinary homicide. The gruesome nature of the crime, the precision of the dismemberment, and the calculated disposal of the remains all pointed to a killer who was not only methodical but also deeply disturbed. As the body count rose, the pressure on the police to catch the Chicago butcher mounted, but despite their best efforts, the investigation quickly hit a wall. The killer seemed to be a ghost, leaving behind no clear evidence, no witnesses, and no discernible pattern beyond the horrifying brutality of his crimes. The formation of a task force. By the time the second body was discovered, the Chicago Police Department had already formed a special task force to handle the case. Led by Detective Sarah Whitman, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving high-profile cases, the team included some of the department's best detectives, forensic experts, and criminal analysts. They called themselves the Butcher Task Force, a grim acknowledgement of the killer's gruesome moniker. "This isn't just another murder case," Sarah told her team during their first meeting. "This is a serial killer, and if we don't stop him, more people are going to die. We need to be smarter, faster, and more relentless than he is." The task force worked around the clock, combing through the evidence from the first two crime scenes. They analyzed the garbage bags, the tools used for dismemberment, and the traces of cooking oil and chemicals found on the bodies. They interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual near the dump sites. But despite their efforts, the killer had left behind almost nothing that could lead them to his identity. A lack of evidence. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the lack of physical evidence. The killer was meticulous, leaving no fingerprints, no DNA, and no personal items that could tie him to the crime scenes. Even the garbage bags and duffel bags used to dispose of the bodies were generic, purchased from common stores that made it impossible to trace them back to a specific buyer. "He's careful," Sarah said during a late-night strategy meeting. "He's thought this through. He knows how to cover his tracks." The forensic team worked tirelessly, analyzing every scrap of evidence they could find. They tested the cooking oil for unique chemical markers, hoping to trace it back to a specific brand or manufacturer. They examined the cuts on the bodies, looking for tool marks that might indicate the type of knife or saw the killer was using, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. "It's like he's invisible," Mark Harris, Sarah's partner, said in frustration. "He's not leaving us anything to work with." The media frenzy. As the investigation stalled, the media frenzy surrounding the case only grew. News outlets ran constant updates on the Chicago butcher, speculating about his identity and motives. True crime shows and podcasts began dissecting the case, offering their own theories about who the killer might be. The public was terrified, and the pressure on the police to deliver results was immense. "Every time we turn on the TV, it's another story about how we're failing to catch this guy," Mark said during a team meeting. "It's like they think we're not even trying." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "Let them talk. We know the truth. We're doing everything we can, but we need a break. We need something, anything, that can point us in the right direction." The media attention also had another, more sinister effect. It seemed to embolden the killer. With each new headline, he became more brazen, leaving bodies in increasingly public places. It was as if he was taunting the police, daring them to catch him. The psychological profile. In an effort to understand the killer's motives and predict his next move, the task force brought in Dr. Alan Grayson, a criminal psychologist with years of experience profiling serial killers. Dr. Grayson spent hours poring over the case files, studying the crime scenes and analyzing the killer's methods. "This man is highly organized," Dr. Grayson said during a briefing with the task force. "He's intelligent, methodical, and deeply sadistic. He's not killing out of impulse, he's killing to fulfill a psychological need. The dismemberment, the cooking, the chemical treatment, these are all part of his ritual. They're how he processes what he's done and reinforces his sense of power." Dr. Grayson also warned that the killer was unlikely to stop on his own. "This isn't someone who's going to wake up one day and decide he's done. He's going to keep killing until we stop him. And with each murder, he's going to get more confident, more brazen, and more dangerous." The dead ends. Despite the task force's best efforts, the investigation continued to stall. Every lead they followed seemed to end in a dead end. Witnesses who thought they had seen something turned out to be mistaken. Surveillance footage from the areas near the dump sites was either missing or too grainy to be useful. Even the psychological profile, while insightful, didn't provide any concrete clues about the killer's identity. "We're spinning our wheels," Mark said one night as he and Sarah sat in the precinct staring at the evidence board. "We've got nothing. No name, no face, no motive. Just a bunch of dead bodies and a city that's scared out of its mind." Sarah didn't respond right away. She was staring at the photos of the victims, her mind racing. "There's something we're missing," she said finally. "Something he's doing that we haven't figured out yet. He's not perfect. He's leaving clues. We just haven't found them." The public's fear. As the investigation dragged on, the public's fear turned to frustration. Community leaders demanded answers, and protests erupted in some neighborhoods, with residents accusing the police of not doing enough to protect them. Women were afraid to walk alone at night, and sales of personal safety devices like pepper spray and tasers skyrocketed. The city was on edge, and the pressure on the task force was unbearable. "We're running out of time," Sarah said during a team meeting. "The longer this goes on, the more people are going to die. We need to find something, anything, that can break this case open." A glimmer of hope. Just when it seemed like the investigation was at a complete standstill, a small breakthrough gave the task force a glimmer of hope. A witness came forward, claiming to have seen a man acting suspiciously near one of the dump sites on the night the second body was discovered. The description was vague, a white male, medium build, wearing a dark hoodie, but it was more than the task force had had in weeks. "It's not much," Mark said as they reviewed the witness statement, "but it's something. Maybe this guy saw something. Maybe he's our guy." Sarah nodded, her determination renewed. "It's a start. Let's run with it." The task force began canvassing the area, interviewing residents and reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses. It wasn't the breakthrough they had been hoping for, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in weeks, the team felt a renewed sense of purpose. The killer's next move. But as the task force worked to follow up on the new lead, the killer was already planning his next move. He was watching the news, reading the headlines, and staying one step ahead of the police. He knew they were closing in, but he wasn't afraid. If anything, the attention only fueled his desire to kill again. For Sarah and her team, the clock was ticking. The Chicago butcher was still out there, and they knew that as long as he remained free, no one in the city was safe. The investigation was at a crossroads, and the next move could mean the difference between catching a killer and losing another life. 6. The first lead, a suspicious truck. After weeks of dead ends and mounting frustration, the Chicago Butcher Task Force finally caught a break, one that would breathe new life into the investigation and give the team their first real chance at catching the killer. It came in the form of a single, seemingly insignificant detail: a suspicious truck spotted near one of the dump sites. At first glance, it didn't seem like much, but as the team dug deeper, they realized this could be the lead they had been waiting for: the witness report. The lead came from a local resident named Carl Jenkins, a retired factory worker who lived near the alley where the third victim's remains had been discovered. Carl had been reluctant to come forward at first, unsure if what he had seen was even relevant, but after seeing the news coverage of the Chicago butcher and the growing body count, he decided to contact the police. "I don't know if this is important," Carl told Detective Sarah Whitman during his initial interview, "but I saw a truck parked in the alley the night before they found that poor girl. It was late, probably around midnight. I remember because I was up watching TV and I heard the engine idling." Sarah leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. "Can you describe the truck, Mr. Jenkins? Anything you remember could be helpful." Carl scratched his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It was an older model, I think. A box truck, white, with no markings on it. Looked like the kind of truck you'd use for deliveries or moving furniture. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, I don't know, it just seemed out of place." "Did you see the driver?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but urgent. Carl shook his head. "No, I didn't get a good look. The windows were tinted and it was dark, but I remember thinking it was strange that the truck was just sitting there idling for so long. It must have been there for at least 15-20 minutes before it drove off." A promising lead. The description of the truck immediately caught the attention of the task force. While it wasn't much to go on, it was the first concrete detail they had about the killer's movements. If the truck had been used to transport the body, it could hold crucial evidence, fibers, blood, or even DNA, that could finally lead them to the Chicago butcher. "This could be it," Sarah said during a team meeting later that day. "If we can find this truck, we might be able to tie it to the killer. Let's start by canvassing the area. Check every business, every security camera, every traffic light within a 5-mile radius of that alley. Someone had to have seen this truck." The team sprang into action, dividing up the work and reaching out to local businesses and residents. They reviewed hours of surveillance footage from nearby gas stations, convenience stores, and traffic cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the truck. It was painstaking work, but the team was determined to follow the lead wherever it took them. The breakthrough. After days of combing through footage, the task force finally caught a break. A traffic camera located 2 blocks from the alley had captured a grainy image of a white box truck driving through the area around the time Carl Jenkins had reported seeing it. While the footage wasn't clear enough to make out the license plate, it confirmed that the truck had been in the vicinity of the crime scene. "This is it," Mark Harris said, pointing to the screen during a late-night meeting. "This has to be our guy. Look at the timing. It matches perfectly with when the body was dumped." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It's not enough to make an arrest, but it's a start. Let's see if we can track this truck. Check every camera along its route and see where it went." The team worked tirelessly, piecing together the truck's movements from one camera to the next. They traced it to a nearby industrial area where it disappeared from view. The area was home to several warehouses, auto repair shops, and storage facilities, places where the killer could easily hide or work without drawing attention. The search for the truck. With the truck's last known location narrowed down to the industrial area, the task force began canvassing the businesses in the vicinity. They showed the grainy image to employees and asked if anyone recognized the vehicle. Most people hadn't seen anything unusual, but one mechanic at a nearby auto shop provided a crucial piece of information. "I've seen a truck like that before," the mechanic said, squinting at the photo. "It comes in here every now and then for maintenance. Belongs to some guy who rents out storage units down the street. I don't know his name, but I've worked on that truck a couple of times. It's an older model, like a 1980s Ford. Pretty beat up." "Do you have any records of the work you've done on it?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. The mechanic nodded. "Yeah, we keep records of all our customers. I can pull it up for you." Within minutes, the mechanic had provided the task force with a name: James R. Miller. According to the records, Miller had brought the truck in for repairs twice in the past year, most recently about 3 months ago. The address listed on the invoice was for a storage facility located just a few blocks away. The storage facility. The task force immediately descended on the storage facility, armed with a warrant to search Miller's unit. The facility manager, a nervous man in his 50s, confirmed that Miller had been renting a unit there for the past 2 years. He described Miller as quiet and unassuming, someone who paid his rent on time and rarely interacted with anyone. "He's here a lot though," the manager said. "Comes in late at night, stays for hours. I always thought it was a little weird, but he never caused any trouble, so I didn't think much of it. When the task force opened Miller's storage unit, they were met with a chilling sight. Inside was a makeshift workshop, complete with tools, chemicals, and a large freezer. The walls were lined with shelves holding various containers, some of which appeared to contain human remains. The smell was overwhelming, and even the most seasoned investigators struggled to keep their composure. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the horror in her eyes. "We've found his lair. The hunt for Miller." While the discovery of the storage unit was a major breakthrough, James R. Miller himself was nowhere to be found. The task force issued an APB for his arrest and began tracking his known associates and last known whereabouts. They also impounded the truck, which was parked outside the storage facility, and sent it to the crime lab for analysis. Inside the truck, forensic experts found traces of blood, hair, and fibers that matched the victims. It was the smoking gun the task force had been searching for, a direct link between Miller and the murders. "He's our guy," Mark said as the evidence poured in. "There's no doubt about it." But the hunt for Miller was far from over. He had vanished without a trace, and the task force knew that as long as he was free, he remained a danger to the public. For Sarah and her team, the discovery of the truck and the storage unit was just the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, one that would push them to their limits as they raced to bring the Chicago butcher to justice. 7. The first suspect, a chef with a criminal past. As the investigation into the Chicago butcher gained momentum, the task force's discovery of the suspicious truck and the gruesome contents of the storage unit led them to their first major suspect, a man named Daniel "Danny" Carter, a former chef with a troubling criminal history. At first glance, Carter seemed like an unlikely candidate for a serial killer. But as the team dug deeper into his past, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that made him a prime suspect in the case. A name emerges. The connection to Carter came through a combination of forensic evidence and witness statements. After the discovery of the storage unit, the task force began interviewing people who had interacted with James R. Miller, the owner of the truck and the storage unit. One name kept coming up: Danny Carter. According to several witnesses, Carter had been seen with Miller on multiple occasions, often late at night near the storage facility. "He's a regular at the diner down the street," one witness told Detective Sarah Whitman, "always sitting in the corner keeping to himself, but I've seen him talking to that guy with the truck a few times. They seemed close." The task force also found Carter's fingerprints on several items inside the storage unit, including a set of knives and a large cutting board. While this wasn't enough to prove his involvement in the murders, it was enough to put him on the task force's radar. A troubling past. As the team began digging into Carter's background, they discovered a history that raised more than a few red flags. Carter, 38, had once been a promising young chef, working at several high-end restaurants in Chicago. But his career had taken a dark turn after a series of violent outbursts and run-ins with the law. In 1995, he had been arrested for assaulting a co-worker with a kitchen knife during an argument. The co-worker survived, but the incident left Carter with a criminal record and a reputation for being volatile and dangerous. "He's got a temper," Mark Harris said as he reviewed Carter's file, "and he knows his way around a knife. That's not a great combination." Carter's criminal record didn't end there. In 1997, he was arrested again, this time for stalking a former girlfriend. According to the police report, Carter had become obsessed with the woman after their breakup, following her to work and leaving threatening notes on her car. While he served time for the stalking charges, he was released on parole after just 2 years. "This guy's got a history of violence against women," Sarah said during a team meeting, "and now he's connected to a storage unit full of human remains. We need to bring him in." The interview. The task force tracked Carter down to a small apartment on the city's west side, where he was living alone and working part-time at a local diner. When they brought him in for questioning, Carter was calm and cooperative, but his demeanor did little to ease the team's suspicions. "Mr. Carter," Sarah began, her tone measured but firm, "we're investigating a series of murders and your name has come up in connection with one of our suspects. Can you tell us about your relationship with James R. Miller?" Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Miller, yeah, I know him. We used to work together a few years back, doing catering gigs. Haven't seen him much lately, though." "Witnesses say they've seen you with him near a storage facility," Mark added, "and we found your fingerprints on items inside that unit. Care to explain that?" Carter shrugged. "I helped him move some stuff a while back. He said he needed an extra pair of hands, so I pitched in. Didn't think it was a big deal. And the knives? Sarah pressed. Your fingerprints were on a set of knives we found in the unit, knives that matched the type used to dismember the victims. At this, Carter's calm facade began to crack. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door. Look, I don't know anything about that. I'm a chef. I work with knives all the time. Maybe I touched them when I was helping him move. That doesn't mean I killed anyone. The forensic evidence. While Carter's explanations were plausible, the forensic evidence continued to pile up against him. In addition to his fingerprints, investigators found traces of cooking oil on the knives and cutting board that matched the type used on the victims. They also discovered a set of chef's uniforms in the storage unit, one of which had Carter's name embroidered on the chest. This guy's got his fingerprints all over the place, Mark said during a briefing, and the cooking oil? That's not a coincidence. He's connected to this. But Sarah wasn't convinced. While the evidence was compelling, it wasn't definitive. There was still no direct link between Carter and the murders, and his calm, cooperative demeanor during the interview didn't fit the profile of a sadistic killer. He's hiding something, Sarah said, pacing the room, but I don't think he's our guy. Not the main one anyway. There's more to this. A complicated relationship. As the team continued to investigate, they uncovered more details about Carter's relationship with Miller. The two men had worked together on and off for years, first in the catering business and later doing odd jobs around the city. According to witnesses, their relationship was complicated, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense. They were close, one former co-worker told the police, but there was always something off about them. Miller was quiet, kept to himself, but Carter, he had a temper. I saw him blow up at Miller a couple of times, yelling about money or something. It was like they needed each other, but they didn't really trust each other. This dynamic raised new questions for the task force. Was Carter an accomplice, helping Miller carry out the murders, or was he being manipulated by Miller, drawn into something he didn't fully understand? The team couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. Carter knew more than he was letting on. The turning point. The breakthrough came when the forensic team analyzed the blood and hair samples found in the truck. While most of the evidence matched the known victims, one sample didn't. It belonged to an unidentified woman who had never been reported missing. When the team confronted Carter with this information, his calm demeanor finally shattered. "I didn't kill anyone," he shouted, his voice trembling. "Miller, he's the one you want. He's the sick bastard who did all this. I didn't know what he was doing, okay? I thought he was just moving stuff. I didn't know about the bodies." Carter's confession, while incomplete, gave the task force a new direction. He admitted to helping Miller transport the truck and clean the storage unit, but denied any involvement in the murders. While his story was difficult to verify, it provided valuable insight into Miller's methods and movements. A suspect, but not the killer. In the end, Carter was charged with obstruction of justice and accessory to murder, but the task force remained focused on their primary target, James R. Miller. Carter's arrest was a step forward, but it was clear that the real monster was still out there, lurking in the shadows. For Sarah and her team, the hunt for the Chicago butcher was far from over. But with Carter's confession and the mounting evidence against Miller, they were closer than ever to bringing the killer to justice. The question now was whether they could catch him before he struck again. 8. The critical discovery, a secret warehouse. The investigation into the Chicago butcher took a dramatic turn when the task force uncovered a secret warehouse that would become the most significant breakthrough in the case. This discovery not only provided a chilling glimpse into the killer's twisted mind, but also brought the team closer than ever to identifying and capturing him. The warehouse, hidden in an industrial district on the outskirts of the city, was a macabre treasure trove of evidence that revealed the full extent of the killer's depravity. A lead that changed everything. The lead that led the task force to the warehouse came from an unexpected source, a routine search of financial records tied to James R. Miller, the primary suspect. While Miller had been careful to cover his tracks, investigators noticed a series of small, recurring payments to a property management company. The payments, made under an alias, were for the rental of a warehouse in a remote part of the city. "This could be it," Detective Sarah Whitman said during a late-night meeting with her team. "If he's been using this place to store evidence or plan his crimes, we might finally have what we need to nail him." The task force wasted no time. Armed with a search warrant, they descended on the warehouse early the next morning. The building was nondescript, one of many in a row of aging industrial properties. From the outside it looked abandoned, with rusted metal doors and broken windows. But as the team approached, they noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt outside, suggesting that someone had been there recently, breaking in. When the team forced open the heavy metal doors, they were immediately hit by a wave of cold, stale air. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint light streaming in through the broken windows. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. "Stay sharp," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "We don't know what we're walking into." As the team moved deeper into the warehouse, their flashlights illuminated a scene that was both horrifying and surreal. The space was divided into several sections, each meticulously organized. In one corner there was a workbench covered in tools, knives, saws, and other implements that looked like they had been modified for purposes far more sinister than their original design. Nearby, there were large plastic containers filled with chemicals, the same type that had been used to dissolve parts of the victims' bodies. "This is it," Mark Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where he's been working." The freezer. The most chilling discovery came when the team found a large industrial freezer tucked away in the back of the warehouse. The freezer was locked, but the team quickly broke it open. Inside, they found what could only be described as a nightmare: human remains, carefully wrapped in plastic and labeled with dates. Each package corresponded to one of the known victims, but there were also several packages that didn't match any of the victims the task force had identified. "Oh my God," one of the officers muttered, turning away from the gruesome sight. "How many more are there?" Sarah forced herself to look, her stomach churning. "This isn't just a crime scene," she said. "This is a trophy room. He's been keeping them, cataloging them." The discovery of the freezer confirmed what the task force had long suspected. The Chicago butcher wasn't just killing for the sake of it. He was preserving parts of his victims, treating them as trophies in a twisted ritual of control and domination. The evidence wall. Another section of the warehouse contained what the team began referring to as the evidence wall. It was a large corkboard covered in photographs, maps, and handwritten notes. The photos included surveillance images of the victims, taken weeks or even months before their deaths. The maps showed the locations where the bodies had been dumped, with pins marking each site. The notes were a mix of cryptic symbols and detailed observations about the victims' routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. "He's been stalking them," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "This wasn't random. He planned every single one of these murders." The evidence wall also included a list of names, some of which had been crossed out. The crossed-out names matched the known victims, but there were several others that hadn't been identified. This raised a chilling possibility. The Chicago butcher had more victims than the task force had realized, and there were likely others who were still in danger. Entered the hidden room. As the team continued to search the warehouse, they discovered a hidden room concealed behind a false wall. The room was small and windowless, with a single chair in the center and a camera mounted on a tripod. The walls were lined with shelves holding videotapes, each labeled with a date and a name. "Please tell me this isn't what I think it is," Mark said as he picked up one of the tapes. Sarah didn't respond. She was already bracing herself for what they were about to see. The team brought the tapes back to the precinct, where they reviewed them in a secure room. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The tapes were recordings of the murders, filmed by the killer himself. Each tape showed the victim being restrained, tortured, and ultimately killed, all with a level of detachment that was as chilling as the acts themselves. "This guy isn't just a killer," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "He's a monster, and he's been documenting everything." The psychological profile deepens. The discovery of the warehouse provided invaluable insight into the killer's psyche. Dr. Alan Grayson, the criminal psychologist consulting on the case, reviewed the evidence and offered his analysis. "This man is a textbook example of a sadistic psychopath," Dr. Grayson said during a briefing. "The warehouse, the freezer, the tapes, these aren't just tools of the trade, they're extensions of his identity. He's not just killing to satisfy a need, he's creating a legacy. He wants to be remembered even if it's for something horrific." Dr. Grayson also noted that the killer's meticulous organization and attention to detail suggested a high level of intelligence and self-control. "He's not impulsive," Grayson said. "Every move he makes is calculated. He's been planning this for years, and he's not going to stop until we catch him." The hunt intensifies. The discovery of the warehouse was a turning point in the investigation, but it also raised new questions. Where was James R. Miller? Was he acting alone or did he have accomplices? And most importantly, how many more victims were there? For Sarah and her team, the warehouse was both a breakthrough and a reminder of the stakes. The Chicago butcher was still out there, and as long as he remained free, no one in the city was safe. But with the evidence they had gathered, the task force was closer than ever to bringing him to justice. "This is it," Sarah said, as she stood in the middle of the warehouse, taking in the full scope of the horror around her. "This is where it ends. We're going to catch him. We have to." 9. The Portrait of a Killer, a Loner with a Twisted Mind. As the investigation into the Chicago butcher reached its most critical phase, the task force began piecing together a psychological and behavioral profile of the killer. With the evidence from the secret warehouse, the tapes, and the testimonies of witnesses, a chilling portrait of the man behind the murders began to emerge. He was not just a killer, but a deeply disturbed individual whose life was shaped by isolation, trauma, and a warped sense of control. The more the task force uncovered, the more they realized they were dealing with a predator who had spent years perfecting his craft and hiding in plain sight. A loner in the shadows. The first thing that became clear about the Chicago butcher was that he was a loner. Witnesses who had interacted with James R. Miller, the primary suspect, described him as quiet, withdrawn, and unremarkable. He lived alone in a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, rarely interacting with neighbors or co-workers. Those who did know him said he kept to himself and avoided forming close relationships. "He was the kind of guy you'd see every day but never really notice," one former co-worker told Detective Sarah Whitman. "He'd come to work, do his job, and leave. Never talked about his personal life, never went out for drinks with the rest of us, just invisible." This invisibility was one of the reasons the killer had been able to evade capture for so long. He blended into the background, never drawing attention to himself. But as the task force dug deeper into his life, they discovered that his isolation wasn't just a personality trait, it was a deliberate choice, a troubled past. Miller's childhood and early life provided crucial clues to understanding his psyche. Born in a small town in Indiana, he grew up in a dysfunctional household marked by abuse and neglect. His father, a factory worker with a drinking problem, was known for his violent outbursts, while his mother was emotionally distant and often absent. Miller spent much of his childhood alone, retreating into his own world to escape the chaos at home. He never had a chance, Dr. Alan Grayson, the criminal psychologist consulting on the case, explained during a briefing. Children who grow up in environments like that often develop deep-seated feelings of worthlessness and anger. For someone like Miller, those feelings likely festered over time, warping his sense of self and his view of the world. School records revealed that Miller had been a quiet but intelligent student, excelling in subjects like math and science. However, he struggled socially, often being bullied by his peers for his awkward demeanor and shabby appearance. Teachers described him as withdrawn and emotionally detached, noting that he rarely participated in class discussions or group activities. By the time he reached adulthood, Miller had become a full-fledged recluse. He worked a series of low-paying jobs, never staying in one place for long. His co-workers described him as competent but cold, someone who did his work efficiently but never engaged with others. It was during this time that he began renting the warehouse and purchasing the tools and chemicals that would later be used in his crimes. A twisted mind. The evidence found in the warehouse painted a disturbing picture of Miller's mental state. The tapes, the freezer, and the evidence wall all pointed to a man who was not only methodical but also deeply sadistic. He didn't just kill his victims, he studied them, stalked them, and turned their deaths into a ritual. "This isn't about rage or impulse," Dr. Grayson said. "This is about control. Miller didn't just want to kill these women, he wanted to own them. The stalking, the cataloging, the preservation of their remains, it's all part of his need to dominate and dehumanize them." The task force also discovered a collection of journals in the warehouse, filled with Miller's thoughts and observations. The entries were chilling in their detail, describing his victims as projects and experiments. He wrote about their routines, their vulnerabilities, and his plans for how he would capture and kill them. But what stood out most was the way he dehumanized his victims, referring to them not by name but by numbers or nicknames like the Blonde or the Runner. "He doesn't see them as people," Sarah said as she read through the journals. "To him they're objects, things he can use and discard, the role of isolation." Miller's isolation played a key role in his transformation into a killer. Without meaningful relationships or a support system, he retreated further into his own mind, creating a world where he was in complete control. His journals revealed a deep resentment toward society, particularly women, whom he blamed for his feelings of inadequacy and rejection. "This is someone who feels powerless in his everyday life," Dr. Grayson explained. "By killing, he's reclaiming that power. It's not just about the act itself, it's about the planning, the stalking, the control. That's where he gets his sense of satisfaction." Miller's isolation also allowed him to operate without suspicion. He had no close friends or family members who might notice his strange behavior, and his reclusive lifestyle made it easy for him to hide his activities. Even his neighbors, who lived just a few feet away, had no idea what he was doing. "I always thought he was just a quiet guy," one neighbor said during an interview. "He'd nod if you said hello, but that was it. I never would have guessed he was capable of something like this." The mask of normalcy. Despite his twisted mind, Miller was able to maintain a facade of normalcy that allowed him to evade detection. He paid his bills on time, held down a steady job, and avoided any behavior that might draw attention to himself. This ability to blend in was one of the most chilling aspects of his personality. "He's a chameleon," Sarah said during a team meeting. "He knows how to act normal, how to stay under the radar. That's what makes him so dangerous." The task force also discovered that Miller had a keen understanding of forensic science and police procedures, likely gained from years of watching true crime shows and reading about famous serial killers. He knew how to cover his tracks, leaving behind little evidence that could tie him to the murders. Even the warehouse, with its meticulous organization and lack of personal items, was designed to minimize the risk of discovery. The final puzzle piece. As the task force continued to build their case, they realized that understanding Miller's psychology was the key to catching him. His need for control, his resentment toward women, and his meticulous planning all pointed to a man who was unlikely to stop on his own. But they also knew that his arrogance, the belief that he was smarter than the police, could be his downfall. "He thinks he's untouchable," Sarah said, "but everyone makes mistakes. We just have to find his." The discovery of the warehouse and the psychological profile of Miller brought the task force closer than ever to capturing the Chicago butcher. But as they prepared to make their move, they knew that time was running out. Miller was still out there, and as long as he remained free, no one in the city was safe. For Sarah and her team, the portrait of the killer was complete. Now they just had to find him, and when they did, they would make sure he never hurt anyone again. 9. The portrait of a killer, a loner with a twisted mind. As the Chicago Butcher Task Force delved deeper into the case, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a chilling portrait of the man behind the murders. The evidence from the warehouse, the journals, and the testimonies of those who had crossed paths with him painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual. A loner whose psychological scars had festered into a dark and twisted obsession. The more the task force uncovered, the more they realized they were dealing with a man who had spent years perfecting his craft, hiding in plain sight and feeding his insatiable need for control and domination. The early years, a life of isolation and trauma. The first step in understanding the killer was to look at his past. James R. Miller, the primary suspect, had grown up in a small, rural town in Indiana. His childhood was marked by neglect, abuse, and a profound sense of isolation. His father, a factory worker with a violent temper, was known for his heavy drinking and frequent outbursts. His mother, emotionally distant and overwhelmed, often left Miller to fend for himself. He was invisible, even in his own home. Dr. Alan Grayson, the criminal psychologist consulting on the case, explained during a briefing. Children who grow up in environments like this often develop a deep sense of worthlessness. They feel unseen, unheard, and unloved. For someone like Miller, that kind of emotional neglect can be just as damaging as physical abuse. School records revealed that Miller was a quiet, withdrawn child who struggled to connect with his peers. Teachers described him as intelligent but unengaged, noting that he rarely participated in class discussions or group activities. He was often the target of bullying, which only deepened his sense of alienation. "He was the kid who sat in the back of the classroom staring out the window," one former teacher recalled. "You could tell he was smart, but he just didn't care. It was like he was in his own little world." By the time Miller reached his teenage years, his isolation had become a defining feature of his personality. He spent most of his time alone, reading books about anatomy, chemistry, and criminal psychology. While his peers were going to parties and dating, Miller was retreating further into his own mind, building a world where he was in control. The making of a killer. Miller's early adulthood provided more clues about the man he would become. After graduating high school, he moved to Chicago, where he worked a series of low-paying jobs. He lived alone in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, rarely interacting with neighbors or co-workers. Those who did know him described him as polite but distant, someone who kept to himself and avoided forming close relationships. He was the kind of guy you'd see every day but never really notice, one former co-worker told Detective Sarah Whitman. He'd come to work, do his job, and leave. Never talked about his personal life, never went out for drinks with the rest of us, just invisible. But while Miller appeared unremarkable on the surface, his private life told a very different story. The journals found in the warehouse revealed a man who was deeply resentful of society, particularly women. He wrote about feeling rejected, overlooked, and powerless, blaming others for his failures and frustrations. "This is someone who feels like the world has wronged him," Dr. Grayson explained. "He's angry, but he doesn't express that anger outwardly. Instead, he internalizes it, letting it fester until it becomes something much darker." The journals also revealed the meticulous planning that went into each of Miller's crimes. He didn't just kill his victims, he studied them, stalked them, and turned their deaths into a ritual. He referred to his victims as projects and experiments, dehumanizing them and reducing them to objects he could control. A twisted obsession with control. One of the most striking aspects of Miller's profile was his need for control. Every aspect of his crimes, from the stalking to the dismemberment, was designed to assert his dominance over his victims. The evidence wall in the warehouse, with its maps, photographs, and detailed notes, was a testament to his obsession with planning and precision. "This isn't about rage or impulse," Sarah said during a team meeting. "This is about power. He doesn't just want to kill, he wants to own them. Every move he makes is calculated." The tapes found in the hidden room provided further insight into Miller's psyche. Each tape documented the murder of a victim, filmed with a level of detachment that was as chilling as the acts themselves. He didn't just kill for the sake of it, he wanted to relive the experience, to preserve it as a trophy. "He's not just a killer," Mark Harris said after reviewing one of the tapes. "He's a predator, and he's been perfecting his craft for years." The role of isolation. Miller's isolation was both a cause and a symptom of his crimes. Without meaningful relationships or a support system, he retreated further into his own mind, creating a world where he was in complete control. His journals revealed a deep resentment toward society, particularly women, whom he blamed for his feelings of inadequacy and rejection. "This is someone who feels powerless in his everyday life," Dr. Grayson explained. "By killing, he's reclaiming that power. It's not just about the act itself, it's about the planning, the stalking, the control. That's where he gets his sense of satisfaction." Miller's isolation also allowed him to operate without suspicion. He had no close friends or family members who might notice his strange behavior, and his reclusive lifestyle made it easy for him to hide his activities. Even his neighbors, who lived just a few feet away, had no idea what he was doing. "I always thought he was just a quiet guy," one neighbor said during an interview. "He'd nod if you said hello, but that was it. I never would have guessed he was capable of something like this." The mask of normalcy. Despite his twisted mind, Miller was able to maintain a facade of normalcy that allowed him to evade detection. He paid his bills on time, held down a steady job, and avoided any behavior that might draw attention to himself. This ability to blend in was one of the most chilling aspects of his personality. "He's a chameleon," Sarah said during a team meeting. "He knows how to act normal, how to stay under the radar. That's what makes him so dangerous." The task force also discovered that Miller had a keen understanding of forensic science and police procedures, likely gained from years of watching true crime shows and reading about famous serial killers. He knew how to cover his tracks, leaving behind little evidence that could tie him to the murders. Even the warehouse, with its meticulous organization and lack of personal items, was designed to minimize the risk of discovery. The final puzzle piece. As the task force continued to build their case, they realized that understanding Miller's psychology was the key to catching him. His need for control, his resentment toward women, and his meticulous planning all pointed to a man who was unlikely to stop on his own. But they also knew that his arrogance, the belief that he was smarter than the police, could be his downfall. "He thinks he's untouchable," Sarah said, "but everyone makes mistakes. We just have to find his." The portrait of the Chicago butcher was complete. a loner with a troubled past, a twisted mind, and an insatiable need for control. For Sarah and her team, the challenge now was to use that knowledge to bring him to justice. The clock was ticking, and they knew that as long as Miller remained free, no one in the city was safe. 11. The cold confession. After months of relentless investigation, a heart-pounding chase, and the dramatic arrest of James R. Miller, the Chicago butcher, the task force finally had their man in custody. But the work was far from over. The next step was to get Miller to talk, to extract a confession that would solidify the case against him and provide answers to the questions that had haunted the city for months. What followed was a chilling, calculated confession that revealed the depths of Miller's depravity and left even the most seasoned detectives shaken. The interrogation room. James R. Miller sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table in front of him. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows on his gaunt face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and the faint smirk that played on his lips. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was an unsettling calm about him, as if he were in control of the situation even now. Detective Sarah Whitman stood on the other side of the one-way glass, watching him closely. She had spent months chasing this man, piecing together the horrors he had left in his wake. Now, as she prepared to face him, she felt a mix of anger, disgust, and determination. "You ready for this?" Mark Harris asked, standing beside her. Sarah nodded, her jaw set. "He's not walking out of here without giving us something." With that, she stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She placed a thick folder of evidence on the table and sat down across from Miller, her eyes locking onto his. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Detective Whitman," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I've been expecting you. The opening moves." Sarah ignored the comment, opening the folder and spreading out photographs of the victims, the crime scenes, and the evidence found in the warehouse. She watched Miller's reaction, or lack thereof, as his eyes flicked over the images. There was no remorse, no hesitation. If anything, he seemed almost amused. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Sarah said, her tone calm but firm. 8 women, that we know of. 8 lives you destroyed, and for what?" Miller tilted his head, his smirk never faltering. "You make it sound so dramatic," he said. "I didn't destroy anything. I created something. Something beautiful." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. "Beautiful?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "You call what you did to those women beautiful?" Miller leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a twisted kind of pride. "You don't understand, detective. None of you do. Those women, they were chosen. They were special. I gave them a purpose." The confession begins. For the next several hours, Miller spoke with a chilling detachment, recounting his crimes in excruciating detail. He described how he had stalked each of his victims, studying their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He spoke of the thrill he felt as he planned their abductions, the satisfaction of watching them struggle, and the sense of power he gained from taking their lives. "They were so predictable," he said, his tone almost conversational. "They went about their lives, oblivious to everything around them. It was pathetic, really. But it made them easy to follow, easy to control." Sarah clenched her fists under the table, forcing herself to stay composed. "And the warehouse?" she asked. "The freezer, the tapes, what was that, your trophy room?" Miller chuckled, a low, hollow sound that sent a shiver through the room. "Trophies? No, detective, they were reminders. Each one of them was a masterpiece, a work of art. I couldn't just let them go, I had to preserve them, to keep them with me." "And the tapes?" Sarah pressed. "Why record it? Why document everything?" Miller's smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity. "Why does an artist paint? Why does a writer keep a journal? I wanted to remember, to relive the moment, to perfect my craft." The motive. As the confession continued, Miller revealed the twisted logic behind his actions. He spoke of his hatred for women, his belief that they were weak, manipulative, and undeserving of the lives they led. He blamed them for his own failures, his loneliness, his feelings of inadequacy. "They think they're so special," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But they're not. They're all the same. Shallow, selfish, useless. I showed them what they really are. I stripped away the lies, the masks. I made them honest." Sarah felt her stomach turn, but she refused to let him see her disgust. "And that's what this was about?" she asked. "Your hatred? Your need to feel superior?" Miller shrugged, his smirk returning. "Call it what you want. I call it justice." The turning point. Despite his willingness to talk, Miller was careful not to incriminate himself too directly. He spoke in vague terms, referring to his crimes as projects, and his victims as subjects. But Sarah knew how to push his buttons, how to exploit his arrogance and draw out the details they needed. "You think you're so clever," she said, leaning forward. "But you made mistakes. You left evidence. You got sloppy." Miller's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't make mistakes," he said, his voice cold. "If you found me, it's because I wanted you to." "Is that so?" Sarah shot back. "You wanted to get caught? Is that why you ran? Why you tried to stab me?" For the first time, Miller's composure cracked, his jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll never understand what I've done, what I've created." "Then help me understand," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Tell me why. Tell me everything." The final admission. In the end, it was Miller's ego that sealed his fate. He couldn't resist the opportunity to explain himself, to justify his actions, to prove that he was smarter than everyone else. He confessed to all 8 murders, describing each one in chilling detail. He even admitted to additional victims the task force hadn't yet identified, their names and faces etched into his memory like a twisted gallery of his work. When the confession was over, Sarah stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve unbroken. She gathered the evidence and turned to leave, but Miller's voice stopped her. "You think this is over, detective?" he said, his smirk returning. "It's not. You'll think about me. You'll remember me. Long after I'm gone, I'll still be here." Sarah didn't respond. She walked out of the room, the door slamming shut behind her. For a moment she stood in the hallway, her hands trembling as the weight of the confession sank in. Then she straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked back to the task force. "It's done," she said, her voice firm. "We've got him." The aftermath. Miller's confession was the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence needed to ensure he would never see the outside world again. For the families of his victims, it was a bittersweet moment, a chance to see justice served, but also a reminder of the horrors their loved ones had endured. For Sarah, the case would leave a lasting scar. Miller's words, his smirk, his cold, calculated confession, they would haunt her for years to come. But as she looked out at the city she had sworn to protect, she knew one thing for certain. The Chicago Butcher was finished, and he would never hurt anyone again. 1-2. The verdict and the lessons learned. The trial of James R. Miller, the man infamously known as the Chicago Butcher, was one of the most highly publicized and emotionally charged cases in the city's history. After months of investigation, a dramatic arrest, and a chilling confession, the task force had built an airtight case against him, but the road to justice was far from over. The courtroom became the final battleground where the families of the victims, the prosecution, and the defense all came face to face with the man who had terrorized the city. The verdict, when it finally came, was not just a moment of justice but also a sobering reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of society. The trial. A city watches. The trial began 6 months after Miller's arrest, and from the very first day, it captivated the nation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and the families of the victims, all eager to see the man who had caused so much pain finally held accountable. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs demanding justice and chanting the names of the women whose lives had been taken. Detective Sarah Whitman, who had led the task force that brought Miller to justice, sat in the front row of the gallery, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the relentless effort it had taken to bring him to trial. She had spent countless sleepless nights poring over evidence, chasing leads, and piecing together the puzzle of Miller's crimes. Now, as she watched him sit at the defense table, his expression as cold and detached as ever, she felt a mix of anger, relief, and determination. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Monroe, presented a case that was as thorough as it was devastating. Over the course of several weeks, they laid out the evidence in painstaking detail. The tapes, the journals, the freezer full of remains, and Miller's own confession. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a man who had not only committed unspeakable acts but had done so with meticulous planning and a complete lack of remorse. This was not the work of a man who lost control, Monroe said during her opening statement. This was the work of a predator, a man who hunted his victims, who took pleasure in their suffering, and who believed he was untouchable. But today, we will show him, and the world, that no one is above the law. The defense, a desperate attempt. Miller's defense team faced an uphill battle from the start. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his confession left little room for doubt. Still, they attempted to argue that Miller was mentally ill, incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. They brought in psychologists who testified that Miller suffered from severe antisocial personality disorder and a history of childhood trauma, which they claimed had warped his sense of morality. "He is not a monster," the defense attorney argued. "He is a deeply disturbed man who fell through the cracks of our society. He needs treatment, not vengeance." But the prosecution was quick to dismantle this argument. They pointed to the meticulous planning that had gone into each of Miller's crimes, the calculated way he had stalked his victims, and the chilling pride he had taken in his actions. They argued that Miller knew exactly what he was doing, and that his crimes were the result of choice, not compulsion. "This is not a man who acted out of impulse or insanity," Monroe said during her closing argument. "This is a man who acted out of hatred, out of a desire for control, and out of a belief that he was above the law. He is not a victim, he is a predator, and he must be held accountable." The verdict: justice delivered. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood and read the words that so many had been waiting to hear. "We, the jury, find the defendant James R. Miller guilty on all counts." The families of the victims wept openly, some embracing each other, others simply bowing their heads in quiet relief. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of "Justice for the victims" echoing through the streets. Miller, for his part, showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap, his expression as blank as it had been throughout the trial. But for Sarah, who had spent months chasing him, his lack of reaction was just another reminder of the kind of man he was, a man who felt nothing for the lives he had taken. During the sentencing phase, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke of Miller's actions, calling them a calculated and cold-blooded campaign of terror. He sentenced Miller to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again walk free. "For the families of the victims, I hope this brings some measure of closure," the judge said. "And for the defendant, I can only say this: you will spend the rest of your life in the darkness you created." The lessons learned. The case of the Chicago butcher left a lasting impact on the city and the people who had worked to bring him to justice. For Sarah and the task force, it was a sobering reminder of the importance of vigilance, teamwork, and perseverance in the face of evil. "This case changed all of us," Sarah said during a press conference after the trial. "It reminded us that monsters don't always look like monsters, sometimes they look like the guy next door, but it also showed us what we're capable of when we work together, when we refuse to give up no matter how hard it gets." The case also led to changes in how the city approached violent crime. New resources were allocated to law enforcement, including funding for advanced forensic technology and training programs for detectives. Community outreach programs were established to help identify and support at-risk individuals, in the hopes of preventing future tragedies. For the families of the victims, the trial was a bittersweet moment. While they were grateful to see Miller brought to justice, they knew that nothing could bring back the women they had lost. Still, many of them found solace in the fact that their loved ones' stories had not been forgotten. "They were more than victims," one family member said during a memorial service. "They were daughters, sisters, friends. They were loved, and now they will be remembered." A city moves forward. As the city of Chicago began to heal, the case of the Chicago butcher became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world, but also of the strength and resilience of those who fight to bring it to light. For Sarah, the case would always be a part of her, a scar that would never fully fade. But as she looked out at the city she had sworn to protect, she knew that the fight had been worth it. "Justice isn't perfect," she said in an interview years later. "It doesn't erase the pain or bring back the people we've lost, but it's what we have. And as long as I'm here, I'll keep fighting for it."